The war had been going on for 3 long years. Humanity fought against the Zakari Empire across many planets in the outer regions of known space. The Zakari were tall creatures that looked somewhat like cats but walked on 2 legs like humans. They stood over 7 feet tall with sleek fur covering their bodies and sharp claws on their hands. They had expected humans to surrender quickly when the war started. But humans were tougher than the Zakari had thought. Now both sides were stuck in a war that neither could win easily. Lieutenant Sophie Grant was only 24 years old, but she had already seen more combat than most soldiers twice her age. She had joined the Terran Defense Force right out of college when the war started. Her brown hair was usually tied back in a tight bun, and her green eyes had developed a hardness that came from seeing too much death. She was small compared to most soldiers, standing only 5 feet 4 inches tall, but she was quick and smart. Sophie was leading a small team on the planet Kepler 442b. The planet had been beautiful once, with blue oceans and green forests. Now much of it was burned and destroyed from the fighting. Her mission was simple: scout the area around an old mining colony and report back on enemy positions. It should have been a routine mission. Sophie had done dozens of them before. Everything went wrong on the 3rd day. Her team of 6 soldiers was moving through the ruins of what used to be a small town. The buildings were mostly collapsed and burned vehicles lined the streets. Sophie was checking her scanner when the first plasma bolt flew past her head. The air sizzled where it passed. Then all hell broke loose. Zakari shock troops came from everywhere. They must have been waiting in ambush. Sophie's team returned fire, but they were outnumbered badly. The sound of plasma weapons filled the air with a sharp crackling noise. Sophie saw her communications officer go down, then her second in command. She shouted orders trying to organize a retreat, but the Zakari had them surrounded. A nearby explosion threw Sophie off her feet. She hit the ground hard, her head ringing. When she looked up, her team was scattered. Some were down and not moving. Others were running in different directions. Sophie made a quick decision. She ran toward a collapsed building and squeezed through a gap in the rubble. Behind her, she could hear the Zakari shouting to each other in their rough, growling language. Sophie spent 2 days hiding in the ruins. She moved from building to building, always staying quiet, always staying hidden. She had lost her weapon in the explosion, and she only had a small knife left. Her rations were gone. She had a little water, but it would not last long. The Zakari were searching for survivors, and several times they came close to finding her. On the 3rd day, Sophie was so thirsty she could barely think straight. She had to find water or she would die. She waited until dark and then moved toward what looked like an old house. Maybe there would be water inside. She was so focused on the house that she did not see the patrol until it was too late. Lights hit her from 3 directions. Sophie froze. 6 Zakari soldiers surrounded her. Their weapons pointed at her chest. They were huge up close, their eyes glowing slightly in the darkness. One of them said something in their language. Sophie slowly raised her hands. She knew when she was beaten. They were not rough with her, which surprised Sophie. They took her knife and checked her for other weapons. One of them scanned her dog tags with a small device. Sophie watched as the device beeped and showed information on a small screen. The Zakari soldiers suddenly became very alert. They talked quickly among themselves, and Sophie noticed they kept looking at her differently now. Like she was important somehow. They put restraints on her wrists and led her to a transport vehicle. The vehicle was big enough to hold all of them comfortably, which meant it was huge by human standards. Sophie sat between 2 guards who watched her carefully. The ride took about an hour, and Sophie tried to memorize the route, but there were too many turns. When they arrived at their destination, Sophie's breath caught. The compound was massive. It spread across several square miles with high walls and guard towers everywhere. Ships were landing and taking off constantly. This was not just a base. This was a major command center. Sophie realized she was in serious trouble. They knew who she was, and they had brought her to someone important. They marched her through the compound. Sophie kept her eyes moving, noting everything she could. Guard positions, vehicle types, the layout of the buildings. It was automatic after all her training. Even as a prisoner, she was still a soldier. Other Zakari stopped to stare at her as they passed. Some looked curious. Some looked hostile. None looked friendly. The detention wing was not what Sophie expected. Instead of a dirty cell with bars, she was put in a room that had actual furniture. There was a bed with a thin mattress and blankets. There was a small sink and toilet. There was even a climate control panel on the wall. The door was sealed with an energy barrier that shimmered with a blue light, but otherwise it looked almost comfortable. Sophie sat on the bed and tried to think. Why was she here? Why the special treatment? She was just a lieutenant. She did not know any important secrets. Nothing about her should matter to the Zakari High Command. Her answer came that evening. She heard heavy footsteps approaching, and then he was there. General Kashira was even bigger than the regular soldiers, standing at least 7.5 feet tall. His fur was dark with black stripes running through it, and his amber eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. He wore a uniform that was decorated with medals and symbols of rank. Everything about him screamed power and authority. The general walked slowly around her cell, studying her from every angle. Sophie stood at attention and met his gaze. She refused to show fear even though her heart was pounding. Her father had taught her that showing weakness only invited more trouble. So she stood straight and looked the general right in his strange cat-like eyes. General Kashira stopped in front of her cell. He tilted his head slightly, studying her face. Then he made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a hum. It might have been approval or it might have been something else. Sophie could not tell. After a long moment, the general turned and walked away without saying a single word. Sophie finally let out the breath she had been holding. She sat down on the bed and put her head in her hands. Whatever was going on, whatever reason they had for bringing her here, she would find out soon enough. For now, all she could do was wait and watch and try to stay alive. 3 days passed slowly in the cell. Sophie fell into a routine because routines helped keep her mind sharp. She would wake up early and do exercises in the small space, push-ups, sit-ups, anything to keep her body strong. Then she would study every inch of her cell, looking for weaknesses. She would watch the guards when they brought her food. She memorized their schedules and their habits. It was what her training had taught her to do. The food was strange but not bad. It was clearly meant for Zakari, with a lot of meat and some vegetables she did not recognize. But it filled her stomach and gave her energy. The guards never spoke to her. They would slide the tray through a small opening in the energy barrier and then leave. They watched her with their cat-like eyes but showed no emotion. On the 4th day, something different happened. Sophie was lying on her bunk staring at the ceiling when she heard a sound. It was not the heavy footsteps of the guards. This was lighter, softer, almost sneaky. She sat up slowly and looked toward the energy barrier. 2 small faces peeked around the corner. Sophie's eyes went wide. They were children. Zakari children, but children nonetheless. They were tiny compared to the adult soldiers, probably only about 3 feet tall. One had golden fur with patches of white on its face and chest. The other had darker fur with tabby-like stripes. Both had enormous eyes that seemed to take up half their faces, and their ears were perked up with interest. Sophie did not move. She barely breathed. The cubs stared at her for a long moment, their little tails swishing back and forth behind them. Then the golden one whispered something to the striped one. Sophie's translator implant picked up a few words. Human. Small. Soft. Hello, Sophie said quietly. Her voice was gentle, the same tone she would use with any scared animal or child. The cubs jumped at the sound, but they did not run away. Instead, they moved closer to the energy barrier. Their noses were practically touching it now as they studied her. Sophie slowly held up her hand and waved. The cubs looked at each other and then back at her. The striped one tentatively raised its paw and copied her movement. Sophie smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in days. The golden cub made a sound that might have been a giggle. For several minutes they just looked at each other. Sophie stayed very still, letting them study her. She could see their minds working behind those big eyes. They were curious but also nervous. Finally, a guard came around the corner and shouted something. The cubs squeaked in surprise and ran away. Sophie heard their small feet pattering on the floor as they disappeared. The guard looked at Sophie suspiciously but said nothing. The next day, the cubs came back. This time they stayed longer. Sophie sat on the floor near the barrier so she would be at their eye level. She pointed to herself and said her name slowly. Sophie. The cubs looked at each other. The golden one pointed at itself and said something that sounded like Kira. The striped one said something like Tomas. Sophie repeated the names and the cubs seemed pleased. Over the following days, the visits became regular. The cubs would show up during what Sophie guessed was their free time. They would sit outside her cell and watch her with endless fascination. Sophie started teaching them simple words in English. She would point at things and name them: hand, nose, eyes, hair. The cubs would repeat the words in their high-pitched voices, often getting them adorably wrong. Sophie found herself looking forward to these visits. The cubs were innocent and sweet, untouched by the hatred and violence of the war. When they looked at her, they did not see an enemy. They just saw something new and interesting. It reminded Sophie that not everything in the universe was about fighting and killing. She started showing them games. She would play peekaboo with them through the barrier, covering her face with her hands and then revealing it suddenly. The cubs thought this was hilarious. They would fall over each other laughing, their tails waving wildly. She taught them pat-a-cake, though it was hard to do through the energy barrier. The cubs tried to copy her hand movements. The guards noticed the visits but did not stop them. Sophie watched their reactions carefully. Some guards seemed amused by the cubs' interest in the human prisoner. They would smile in that way that adults smile at children doing something cute. Other guards seemed more concerned, but none of them reported it or chased the cubs away with much enthusiasm. Sophie began to suspect these were not ordinary children. The way the guards treated them with gentle firmness rather than strictness suggested they were important. Maybe they were related to high-ranking officers. Maybe even to General Kashira himself. The thought made Sophie nervous. If something happened to these cubs while they were visiting her, she could not imagine the consequences. But the cubs kept coming back, and Sophie could not bring herself to scare them away. They were bright spots in the darkness of her captivity. Kira was bold and adventurous, always trying to get closer to the barrier. Thomas was more cautious but also more curious, always asking questions that Sophie could only partially understand through her translator. One day, Kira brought something with her. It was a small toy, a stuffed animal that looked like some kind of Zakari creature. Kira held it up to show Sophie, clearly proud of it. Sophie gave it a thumbs up, and Kira seemed to understand this was approval. Thomas brought a toy the next day, too, some kind of puzzle cube. Sophie watched as he played with it, solving it quickly with his small paws. The cubs started trying to teach Sophie words in their language, too. They would point at things and say the Zakari word slowly. Sophie tried to repeat them, though the growling, purring sounds were hard for her human throat to make. The cubs found her attempts funny, but not in a mean way. They would giggle and try to help her get the sounds right. Sophie realized something during these visits. For all their differences, children were children no matter what species they were. They were curious and playful and innocent. They wanted to learn and explore and make friends. The war had nothing to do with them. They had not chosen to be enemies. Adults had decided that for them. 2 weeks into her captivity, Sophie had become genuinely fond of the cubs. She worried about them when they did not show up on time. She celebrated their small achievements, like when Thomas finally learned to say hello clearly in English. She laughed at their antics when they would chase each other in circles before settling down to visit with her. What Sophie did not know was that these visits were being watched very carefully by General Kashira himself. He had installed hidden cameras in the detention wing specifically to observe how his children interacted with the human prisoner. What he saw confused him and challenged everything he thought he knew about humans. He watched Sophie be gentle and patient with his cubs. He watched her teach them and play with them. He watched her face light up when they arrived and saw genuine care in her eyes. This was supposed to be the enemy. Humans were supposed to be brutal and violent and without honor. But this small human woman showed his children more kindness than some of his own officers did. General Kashira did not know what to make of it. But he knew that something important was happening in that cell, something that might change everything he believed about this war. It was the 8th night of Sophie's captivity when everything changed. She had been sleeping lightly as she always did since her capture. Even in sleep, part of her mind stayed alert for danger. It was a skill she had learned in her first months of combat. So when she sensed movement in her cell, her eyes opened immediately. At first, Sophie thought she was dreaming. The blue energy barrier that normally sealed her cell was dark and inactive. Standing just inside her cell, looking as surprised as she felt, were Kira and Thomas. The cubs were frozen in place, their eyes huge with shock. They clearly had not expected to actually get inside. Sophie's mind raced through possibilities. This could be her chance to escape. She could grab the cubs as hostages and try to negotiate her way out. That was what her training told her to do. Take advantage of every opportunity. But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. She could never use children that way, not even enemy children, not even to save her own life. Before Sophie could say anything, she heard it. Boots. Multiple pairs of heavy boots running through the corridor. The sound was getting closer fast. The cubs heard it too, and panic flashed across their small faces. Their ears flattened against their heads and their tails puffed up with fear. They were clearly somewhere they were not supposed to be, and they knew they were about to be caught. Sophie made a decision in a split second. She sat up quickly and opened her arms. "Come here," she whispered urgently in the Zakari language, hoping she got the words right. "Quick, come," the cubs did not hesitate. They scrambled across the small cell and climbed onto her bunk. They were surprisingly light, their small bodies warm through their fur. Sophie lay back down and let them curl up against her. Kira pressed against her left side while Thomas nestled against her right side, both of them settling on her chest. Sophie pulled her thin blanket over them partially and wrapped her arms around them protectively. The cubs were trembling with fear. Sophie could feel their rapid heartbeats against her body. She made soft shushing sounds and gently stroked their backs. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe. Just close your eyes." She did not know if they understood her words, but they seemed to understand her tone. The trembling slowly decreased. Within moments, exhausted from whatever adventure had brought them to her cell at this hour, both cubs fell asleep. Their breathing became deep and regular. Kira made little snoring sounds that would have been funny under different circumstances. Thomas had one paw clutching Sophie's shirt. They felt trusting and vulnerable in her arms, and Sophie felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. The boots reached her cell. Sophie looked up calmly, though her heart was hammering in her chest. There were at least 6 guards, all with weapons drawn and pointed at her cell. They were clearly in high alert mode, probably expecting to find the cubs in danger or the human prisoner trying to escape. Instead, they stopped dead and stared. For several long seconds, nobody moved or spoke. The guards looked completely baffled. Their weapons slowly lowered as they tried to process what they were seeing. The dangerous human prisoner was lying peacefully on her bunk with General Kashira's missing cubs sleeping soundly on her chest. It was not a scenario anyone had prepared for. Sophie met their stares calmly. She raised one finger to her lips in a universal gesture for quiet. "They're sleeping," she said softly in her broken Zakari. "Please don't wake them." Her translator implant helped, but she knew her accent was terrible. Still, the guard seemed to understand. The senior guard, an older Zakari with gray mixed into his fur, looked like someone had just told him that gravity stopped working. His mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out. His tail lashed in confusion. Finally, he pulled out a communicator and spoke rapidly into it. Sophie caught one word clearly: Kashira. Her stomach dropped. They were calling the general. Of course they were. His children were missing and had been found with the enemy prisoner. This was about to become a serious incident. Sophie just hoped they would believe she had not kidnapped the cubs. She looked down at the 2 small faces sleeping peacefully against her. They looked so innocent and sweet. How could anyone think she would hurt them? More guards arrived within minutes. They formed a perimeter around her cell but made no move to come inside. They just watched and waited. Sophie remained very still, not wanting to wake Kira and Thomas. The cubs were sleeping so deeply now, making little sounds and twitching occasionally. They must have been very tired. Sophie wondered what had happened. How did the cubs get into her cell when the energy barrier should have been active? How did they get away from whatever security was supposed to be watching them? It seemed like too much coincidence. But those were questions for later. Right now, all that mattered was keeping the cubs safe and calm. Then she heard him. The heavy, distinctive footsteps of General Kashira. He was moving fast, faster than Sophie had ever heard a Zakari move. He burst into the corridor with several officers following behind him. His face showed barely controlled panic, the kind of fear only a parent can feel when their children are missing. General Kashira reached her cell and stopped. His amber eyes went wide as he took in the scene. His children, his precious cubs, were curled up on the chest of a human prisoner, sleeping peacefully. Sophie could see the emotions warring on his face. Relief that his children were safe. Confusion about what was happening. Anger that they were here at all. And something else, something that looked like wonder. For a long moment, the general just stared. He seemed unable to move or speak. One of his officers started to say something, but Kashira silenced him with a sharp gesture. The compound was so quiet Sophie could hear her own heartbeat. Even the cub's soft breathing seemed loud in the silence. Kira stirred slightly in her sleep. Her small paw tightened on Sophie's shirt and she made a tiny sound before settling back down. Sophie instinctively adjusted her hold, making sure the cub was comfortable. It was automatic, the way anyone would respond to a sleeping child. She did not think about it, but General Kashira saw it. He saw how gently the human prisoner held his children. He saw that they were completely unharmed and sleeping peacefully. He saw that Sophie could have used them as hostages or weapons, but instead had protected them and let them sleep. His expression slowly changed as understanding dawned. "They came to me," Sophie said quietly, meeting the general's eyes. She spoke in English, knowing he had a translator. "The barrier was down. They were scared because they heard you coming. I didn't hurt them. I would never hurt them." Her voice was steady and sincere. General Kashira's tail lashed once, a sign of strong emotion, but when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I can see that, human." He paused, studying her face. "The question is why my children, who should be safe in their quarters under guard, are instead sleeping in the cell of an enemy soldier." One of the officers stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in Zakari. He kept gesturing at a datapad in his hand, clearly making a report. Sophie caught some of the words through her translator. Malfunction, security system, barrier failure, coincidence. The officer sounded nervous and kept bowing slightly to the general. General Kashira's eyes narrowed as he listened. His ears flattened against his head, which Sophie had learned was a sign of suspicion or anger. A double malfunction that allowed his cubs to leave their quarters and also allowed them into a prisoner's cell? That was too convenient. Someone would pay for this failure, and probably pay dearly. But then the general's attention returned to his sleeping children. He studied them for a long moment, his expression softening despite his obvious anger about the security failure. Thomas had his face buried against Sophie's shoulder now, his breath warm against her neck. Kira had rolled slightly so she was sprawled more fully across Sophie's chest. "They have been visiting me," Sophie admitted, knowing there was no point in hiding it now. "For days. The guards know. The cubs were curious about me. We talked, we played games. I think they started to see me as a friend." She kept her voice low so as not to wake them. The general's ear flicked in surprise. He looked at his guards, who all suddenly found the floor very interesting, so they had known about the visits and not reported them. Kashira would deal with that later. Right now, something more important was happening. "You speak as if befriending the enemy's children is normal for human soldiers," Kashira said. There was no mockery in his voice, only genuine curiosity. Sophie shook her head slightly. "No, sir. It's not normal. But they're children. They're innocent. The war isn't their fault. They didn't choose any of this." She looked down at the sleeping cubs. They just wanted to be curious and playful like all children do. I couldn't turn them away. Something profound shifted in the general's expression. General Kashira stood silent for a long time. His amber eyes moved from his sleeping children to Sophie's face and back again. The other officers and guards waited nervously. Nobody knew what the general would do. He was known for being strict and following military law exactly. But he was also a father, and his children were involved. Finally, the general did something that shocked everyone present. He waved his hand and the remains of the energy barrier deactivated completely. Then he stepped into the cell. His officers immediately tensed. Several reached for their weapons. A prisoner was a prisoner, even a small human female, and the general was putting himself at risk. But Kashira held up one hand to stop them. He moved slowly and carefully, his eyes never leaving his children. He approached the bunk where Sophie lay with Kira and Thomas sleeping on her chest. His movements were gentle despite his massive size. When he reached the bunk, he knelt down so his face was level with his cubs. Sophie barely dared to breathe. The general was so close now she could see the individual hairs in his fur, and the gold flecks in his amber eyes. He smelled like something spicy and clean. His presence was overwhelming, but she forced herself to stay calm. The cubs were still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the drama happening around them. General Kashira reached out one large hand toward his children. His claws were retracted, Sophie noticed. He touched Kira's head very gently, stroking her golden fur with one finger. Then he did the same to Tomas. His face showed such love and relief that Sophie felt her throat tighten. This was not just a general. This was a father who had been terrified for his children. Kira stirred at her father's touch. Her eyes opened slowly, confused by sleep. When she saw her father's face, her eyes went wide. She made a small squeaking sound that might have been Papa in their language. Thomas woke up too, blinking sleepily. When he realized where he was and who was there, he looked scared. But General Kashira did not look angry. He looked relieved. He opened his arms and spoke softly in their language. Sophie did not need a translator to understand. He was calling his children to him. Kira and Thomas scrambled off Sophie and threw themselves into their father's arms. He caught them and held them close, his eyes closing for a moment as he pressed his face against their fur. The cubs were both talking at once, their high voices overlapping as they tried to explain. Sophie caught words here and there through her translator. Sorry, didn't mean to. The barrier was open. Wanted to see the human. Got scared. Her voice was nice. She let us stay. The explanations tumbled out in a rush. General Kashira listened to it all, holding his children tight. When they finally ran out of words, he spoke to them seriously. His voice was low and calm but firm. Sophie could not understand most of it, but she caught the meaning. They were not in trouble for being curious, but they had to understand how dangerous what they had done was. They could have been hurt. He had been so worried. The cubs nodded solemnly, their ears drooping with shame. They clearly understood they had made their father worry. Kira said something that sounded like an apology. Thomas buried his face in his father's chest. The general stroked their backs, comforting them even as he scolded them. After several minutes, Kashira said something else to his children. They both turned to look at Sophie. Their faces were sad. Kira waved one small paw. Thomas did the same. Sophie understood. They were saying goodbye. She sat up slowly and waved back, managing a smile even though she felt an unexpected sadness. In the short time she had known them, these cubs had become important to her. Goodbye, Kira. Goodbye, Thomas, Sophie said softly. The cubs' ears perked up at hearing their names in her voice. They said something back, probably goodbye in their language. Then General Kashira stood still holding his children and carried them toward the cell entrance. But at the doorway, he stopped. He turned back to look at Sophie. His expression was complex, showing many emotions at once. He studied her for a long moment while his cubs clung to his uniform. Finally, he spoke. Lieutenant Sophie Grant. He used her full name and rank for the first time. His voice was formal and serious. You have created a problem for me. By all military law and honor, you are my prisoner. You are my enemy. We are at war, your people and mine. This is clear and simple. He paused. But my children see something in you that makes all of that less clear. Sophie stood up and came to attention, even though she was wearing the simple clothes they had given her instead of a uniform. Permission to speak, sir? She was not sure if asking permission was appropriate, but it seemed respectful. The general's whiskers twitched. It might have been amusement. You asked permission now? After you gave shelter to my children while they slept? After all of that, now you ask permission? He made a sound that was definitely amusement. Yes, Lieutenant. Speak freely. Sophie chose her words carefully. This war started over a misunderstanding, sir. We both know that. It was a trade dispute that got out of control because neither side would back down. Pride and stubbornness on both sides made it worse. She met his eyes directly. But your people and my people are not that different. We both love our families. We both value honor and courage. We both want to protect what is ours. Maybe it's time someone remembered that. The silence that followed was absolute. Every guard, every officer was staring at Sophie. Speaking to a general this way, especially an enemy general, was incredibly bold. Some of the officers looked angry. Others looked shocked. But General Kashira just looked thoughtful. You speak with wisdom, Lieutenant Grant, he said finally. You are young, but you see clearly. He shifted his hold on his children who were watching everything with wide eyes. I will think deeply on what you have said. But understand this. What happened here tonight changes nothing officially. You are still my prisoner. The war continues. I cannot change that with a single decision. He paused at the doorway again. Sophie thought he was going to leave, but then he spoke again. However, you will be moved to better quarters. Not a cell, but a proper room. And if my children wish to visit you, under supervision and with proper security, I will allow it. His eyes met hers. You protected them when you could have used them as weapons or hostages. You showed them kindness when you could have shown them the hatred of war. That means something. Sophie nodded. Thank you, sir. General Kashira turned to his officers. He began giving orders in rapid Zakari. The officers scrambled to obey. Guards were dispatched. Arrangements were made. Through it all, the general held his children, unwilling to let them go just yet. Before he left, Kashira looked at Sophie one more time. My children have good instincts about people, Lieutenant Grant. They liked you immediately. I did not understand why until tonight. He touched Kira's head gently. They saw in you what I was trained not to see in humans. They saw kindness and honor. They saw someone who would protect them even at risk to herself. They're children, sir, Sophie said simply. They deserve to be protected. Yes, the general agreed quietly. They do, all children do. Even in war. Perhaps especially in war, children should be protected. He seemed to be talking to himself as much as to her. My teachers told me humans were brutal and without honor. But you have shown me something different tonight. He carried his cubs out of the cell. The guards followed, though 2 remained posted outside. Sophie was alone again, but everything felt different now. She sat down on her bunk, her arms feeling strangely empty without the warm weight of the cubs. What had just happened? She had comforted 2 scared children. She had spoken honestly to an enemy general. She had suggested that maybe this war did not have to continue. And somehow, instead of being punished, she was being given better quarters and the general had actually listened to her. Sophie lay back down on her bunk. The blanket still smelled faintly of the cubs, a warm scent like cinnamon and something else she could not name. She pulled the blanket up and stared at the ceiling. Her mind was racing, but her body was exhausted. The stress of the last hour had taken its toll. As she drifted toward sleep, Sophie thought about General Kashira's face when he held his children. She thought about how gentle he had been with them despite his fierce reputation. She thought about what he had said about her showing honor and kindness. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something more than endless war. The next morning, Sophie was moved to new quarters as promised. The room was much larger and more comfortable. There was a real bed, a table and chair, even a small window that looked out over part of the compound. It was still clearly a prison, but it was a vast improvement. And true to the general's word, Kira and Thomas were allowed to visit her that very afternoon. Accompanied by 2 guards who watched carefully, but did not interfere. The cubs were shy at first, worried they might be in trouble. But Sophie welcomed them with a smile, and soon they were chattering and playing as if nothing had happened. What Sophie did not know was that General Kashira was watching through cameras again. But this time he was not just observing. He was thinking. Thinking about his children's trust in a human, thinking about what Sophie had said about the war, thinking about what kind of future he wanted for Kira and Thomas. And for the first time in 3 years, General Kashira began to wonder if there might be another path besides endless fighting. The days that followed brought changes that nobody could have predicted. Sophie's new quarters became an unlikely meeting place. Every afternoon, Kira and Thomas would arrive with their guards for their visit. At first, the guards stood rigid and formal, watching Sophie like she might suddenly become dangerous. But as the days passed and they saw only gentle interaction between the human and the cubs, even the guards began to relax. Sophie taught the cubs more English words. They taught her more of their language. The sounds were still difficult for her human throat to make, but she was getting better. The cubs found her mistakes funny, but they also clapped their paws when she got something right. Their joy was infectious, but the visits became more than just language lessons. Sophie told the cubs stories about Earth. She described oceans that went on forever, mountains that touched the sky, forests so thick you could get lost in them. She told them about snow, which they had never seen because their home world was warm. She told them about different animals, trying to describe what a dog or a horse looked like to children who had only known their own world's creatures. The cubs loved the stories. They would sit close to Sophie, their tails curled around their feet, their ears perked forward to catch every word. Sometimes they would ask questions that made Sophie laugh. "Can dogs really fly?" Thomas asked once, mixing up her description of birds and dogs. "Do humans really eat plants?" Kira asked, horrified at the idea. In return, the cubs told Sophie about their home. They described the purple skies of their planet and the 3 moons that rose every night. They told her about the great forests where their ancestors had hunted. They described festivals and celebrations, music and dancing. Through their innocent words, Sophie began to see the Zakari not as faceless enemies, but as people with rich culture and history. The guards listened too, though they pretended not to. Sophie noticed them leaning in slightly to hear better. Sometimes she would see one of them smile at something funny the cub said. Once, when she was describing snow, she saw a guard's eyes go distant, as if remembering something from his own childhood. General Kashira continued to watch through the cameras. He watched his children laugh with the human. He watched them teach each other. He watched Sophie's patience when Thomas struggled with a word, and her genuine delight when Kira mastered a difficult phrase. He watched and he thought. 3 weeks after the incident, the general came to visit Sophie himself. The guards announced him formally, and Sophie stood at attention. But Kashira waved for her to sit down. He took the chair across from her, looking oddly out of place in the small room. His size made everything seem tiny. "My children speak of you constantly," Kashira said without preamble. "Sophie says this. Sophie showed us that. Sophie told us a story about mountains." He studied her face. "You have become important to them." Sophie did not know what to say to that. "They're wonderful children, sir. Smart and curious and kind. You should be proud of them." "I am," Kashira said simply. Then his face became more serious. "But their attachment to you creates a problem, Lieutenant Grant. This war will not last forever. Eventually there will be an end, one way or another. What happens to my children's hearts when you are gone? How do I explain to them that their friend was always the enemy?" Sophie had thought about this too. It kept her awake some nights. "I don't have a good answer for that, sir. I never wanted to hurt them. But maybe," she paused, trying to find the right words, "maybe their friendship with me proves something important. Maybe it proves that your people and mine don't have to be enemies." Kashira leaned back in his chair. It creaked under his weight. "You continue to speak of peace, Lieutenant. But you are a soldier. You have killed my people in battle. I have killed yours. There is blood between us." "Yes, sir," Sophie agreed quietly. "There is, and I can't take that back. Neither can you. But we didn't start this war. Politicians and merchants started it, arguing over trade routes and resources. They made the decision to fight. We just followed orders." She met his eyes. "But we could make a different decision. We could decide that our children deserve better than growing up in endless war." The general was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "It is not so simple. There are others in my command who would see any talk of peace as weakness. There are those among your people who hate us and want only victory. How does one man, even a general, stand against all of that?" "By being brave enough to try," Sophie said. "You're a general. People listen to you. If you said there might be another way, they would at least consider it." She leaned forward. "And I'm not nobody either. My father is Admiral Grant of the Terran Defense Force. If I sent him a message saying I believed peace was possible, he would listen. He would have to." Kashira's ears perked forward in surprise. "You are the daughter of Admiral Grant? The one who commanded the defense of Tau Ceti?" Sophie nodded. Understanding dawned on the general's face. "That is why they brought you here. That is why you are valuable. They hope to use you for intelligence or perhaps exchange you." "Probably," Sophie admitted. "But maybe we can use that for something better. Let me send a message to my father. Let me tell him what I've seen here. Let me tell him about your children and how they see past the war to the person underneath. If he knows that you and I can talk like this, maybe he'll be willing to talk to your leaders too." It was a dangerous suggestion. General Kashira could be accused of treason for even considering it. Sophie could be accused of collaborating with the enemy. Both of them could lose everything. But both of them thought about Kira and Thomas, laughing together as they played with blocks that afternoon. Both of them thought about all the other children, Human and Zakari, who were growing up knowing only war. "I will think on this," Kashira said finally. He stood to leave, then paused. "My children have good instincts, Lieutenant Grant. They saw something in you before I did. Perhaps I should trust their judgment more." He left without another word, but Sophie felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. 2 days later, General Kashira returned with a secure communication device. "One message," he said. "To your father. Tell him what you have told me. Tell him that I am willing to talk privately about the possibility of peace. But make it clear that this is not official. If your people try to use this as a military advantage, all talks end immediately." Sophie took the device with shaking hands. She composed the message carefully, choosing every word with precision. She told her father about her capture, about meeting the general's children, about the conversation she had had with Kashira. She told him that she believed peace was possible if both sides were willing to be brave. She told him she loved him and missed him, but that she was staying here voluntarily now, not as a prisoner but as a bridge between two peoples. The response came 3 days later. Admiral Grant's voice came through the device, thick with emotion. "Sophie, my girl, I've been out of my mind with worry since your squad reported you missing. Knowing you're alive is the greatest relief of my life." There was a pause. "What you're suggesting is dangerous and complicated, but if there's even a chance it could end this war and bring you home, I have to try. Tell General Kashira I will meet with him in secret, neutral location. We'll talk. That's all I can promise. We'll talk." When Sophie played the message for General Kashira, she saw something she had never seen before. The fierce general had tears in his eyes. "Your father is a brave man," he said quietly. "To trust his enemy because his daughter asks him to. That takes great courage." The secret meeting was arranged for 2 weeks later, on a small moon that neither side claimed. Both leaders came with minimal security. The talks lasted for hours. Nobody knows exactly what was said in that room, but both men emerged looking exhausted and thoughtful. It did not bring instant peace. Wars that last 3 years don't end in a day, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, more talks happened. Ceasefires were arranged in certain sectors. Prisoner exchanges were organized. Slowly, painfully, the two sides began to step back from total war. Sophie remained with the Zakari during all of this, with her father's blessing and her own choice. She became an unofficial ambassador, helping to translate not just words but intentions and cultures. Kira and Thomas continued to visit her daily, and Sophie watched them grow and learn, no longer overshadowed by the constant threat of war. General Kashira became an advocate for peace within his own command structure. It cost him. Some of his officers saw him as a traitor. Some refused to follow his orders. But others, especially those with children of their own, began to listen. They began to wonder if their general might be right. On the human side, Admiral Grant faced similar challenges. Hawks in the military command wanted total victory. Politicians worried about appearing weak. But Grant was respected and his daughter's story spread. The image of a human soldier protecting Zakari children touched something deep in people's hearts. 6 months after that night, when 2 scared cubs climbed onto Sophie's chest, a formal ceasefire was declared. It would take another year of negotiations before a real peace treaty was signed. But the fighting stopped. Soldiers on both sides went home to their families. When Sophie finally returned to Earth, she was celebrated as a hero.